Hello everyone, my name is Dylan Spicker. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo, and I am studying statistics. My research specifically addresses questions of causal inference, and I'm interested in figuring out ways to determine whether a relationship that we observe between two factors is such that one thing causes another, or if they are simply related to each other. If you would like to, please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments on anything that we discuss today. Today, I want to talk to you about the pay gap from a statistician's point of view. Note that I'm not an expert at discussing the multitude of ways that discrimination manifests itself in society, nor the ways that we should address these problems. However, I am pretty good at analyzing data and using numbers to try to understand what is true in the world. My goal for today is to sift through the research, data, and news stories on the pay gap and to try to make sense of what exactly is going on. I'm going to focus predominantly on the gender pay gap at the present moment in the United States. Now, while it's commonly called the gender pay gap, in actual fact, official agencies tend to collapse gender and sex into the same thing, and finding good data on pay by gender identity or expression is far more difficult. Still, my overarching goal is to give you a strong sense of the current state of the wage gap, and moreover, to give you strong numeracy to be able to critically analyze claims that are made with data. I want to present to you some of the ways that people lie, intentionally or otherwise, with statistics and try to explain briefly how to overcome this. In 2020, there was a 27.4% pay gap between men and women in the United States. It will be more common for you to hear this expressed as women make 72.6 cents for every dollar that men make. This gap is real, it exists, and it is persistent. So let's take some time to understand what this 27.4% even means, and then explore where it comes from. I want you to imagine for a moment taking every woman in the United States and placing them in a line. Then order these women from the lowest paid individuals to the highest paid individuals. And then consider doing the exact same thing with men, so you put them in a line, order that line up from lowest income to highest income. If you look at the halfway point for women, so the individual who sits such that half of women earn less than her and half of women earn more than her, then in 2020, she made $35,838. If you do the same thing with men, he earned $49,389. To emphasize the point, in the United States, in 2020, half of all women made less than $35,838, and half of all women made more than this. Half of all men made less than $49,389, and half made more. We call these halfway values the median income levels. Then we can take these so-called median income values and we can compute an absolute difference, which we get by subtracting how much women make from how much men make. This means that the median income for men is $13,551 more than the median income for women. Instead of subtracting, we will often divide to give us a relative difference. If we do this, we find that it works out to be 0.726, which roughly speaking means that median female earns 72.6 cents for every dollar that the median male earns. Now, there is some trouble with summarizing a full distribution of pay using a single number. There's some work that's been done in using more complex summaries, which paint a more complete picture, but are more complicated to talk through. And so I'll put those aside for today. But if you're interested, you can look up pay fingerprints, and note that empirically this isn't too much of a problem. So that's it, right? We can leave it there. We've established a pay gap of 72.6 cents per dollar. We're done. Now, I expect that some of you will not buy this rationale. I can hear you saying already, Dylan, you're wrong, you did not consider whatever. Without fail, when the pay gap is brought up, the defense from critics is that you did not consider all of the factors that are relevant. In fact, if you had considered it, the pay gap is not even real. So let's explore that critique. I want you to keep something in mind, something that people from statistics and related fields often downplay. Data require interpretation. They are not objective. There is no answer in numbers directly. To understand why this matters, let's discuss how a quantitative analysis actually works. So you start by asking a specific question that's of interest. You then define all of the relevant variables in such a way that they're specific enough to measure them numerically. You then have to go out and find or collect good, high-quality data. Then you use appropriate statistical methods. Finally, you draw careful conclusions which take into account all of the limitations of the choices you just made. What's more, this is an iterative process. You might find that once you've collected your data, your definitions no longer work, and you need to go back and rethink those. The only part of a quantitative analysis that is objective is the application of a technique once it has been selected and once the data are defined. Everything else requires our input. Why does all of this matter? Well, the overall pay gap is important. The overall gap addresses the question, in the aggregate, how does the income of women compare to the income of men? We all understand intuitively that there are many factors that may contribute to this gap, but this gap is still relevant, particularly in a society which places so much power alongside income. Imagine that someone asked you, how tall is the tallest living person? And instead of saying 8 feet 3 inches, you replied, well, first we have to control for their genetics, their access to nutrition, and so on. That kind of misses the point, doesn't it? The question itself is interesting and has an answer, in the same way that the question regarding the aggregate pay gap is interesting and has an answer. Now, we can consider additional factors. However, by doing so, we are changing the question that we have started with. Instead of asking, do women earn less, which has the answer yes very clearly, we're able to explore the myriad of mechanisms through which women are systematically underpaid. You are often going to hear people say, what if you adjust for X in your analysis? I want to dive deeply into what exactly this means, both from a statistical and a practical perspective, so that you can think critically about these claims. Let's explore this by adjusting for the amount that someone works, and then I'll summarize the literature that controls for other factors. In the United States, 42.04% of women over the age of 15 did not work. For men, only 32.24% did not work. This is a 9.8% difference. This is, of course, going to contribute, at least in part, to the overall pay gap. Notice, though, that this reality has not made the argument that women do not face discrimination. Instead, it has just suggested that one of the mechanisms through which the pay gap operates is the proportion of individuals who work. If we look at just part-time workers, either temporary or permanent, we find the same median values for women and men. We can see that they're roughly equivalent, right? So from a statistical perspective, there is no difference between these median values. This is interesting because at face value, this would seem to suggest that for part-time work, there is no pay gap and therefore no discrimination. Then, because women are more likely to work part-time than men are, that explains more of the pay gap. However, this is an oversimplification. Some recent economics research dug more deeply into part-time workers and the supposed lack of a pay gap. One thing that they noticed, as is shown here, is that women who work part-time are more likely to be highly educated than men who work part-time. We know that generally, higher educated people make more money, and so by adding in education as a variable in this analysis, we can see that we would actually expect women part-time workers to earn more than male part-time workers. But we don't see this. As a result, it's not immediately obvious that there is no discrimination going on just because that pay gap is zero. What if we considered only full-time permanent workers? This is what most of the research does, and in the US, in 2020, doing this we can see that the pay gap falls to 83 cents per dollar. Put in another way, roughly 10 cents of the observed aggregate pay gap can be attributed to differences in the status of someone's work. Now, it's important to remember, saying that women are more likely to not work or to work part-time does not necessarily mean that they are not being discriminated against. It just points us towards other areas we may wish to explore beyond explicit pay discrimination. Additionally, as we saw with part-time workers, adding in more factors is not always going to reduce the pay gap. Still, I think it is often of interest to consider full-time workers as it gives us insight into the types of policies that are likely driving inequity inside of the workplace. We can do the same thing that we just did with work status with other factors. The following results are from a study that uses slightly different definitions, but is fairly comparable to what we have been talking through. They also differentiate between salary and total compensation, noting that when you look at the full amount someone is paid, the pay gap is amplified further. The bar graphs show the amount that women are paid for every dollar that men earn after addressing certain other factors. If we take into account age, education, the years of experience, then the gap sits at either 81 cents or 77 cents, depending on whether you are looking at wages or total compensation. If you also consider industry, occupation, location, the year, and the firm size, this falls further to 92 cents or 89 cents. If you consider the specific company, this falls down to 94 cents or 91 cents. And if you control for everything that we just mentioned, in addition to the job title that someone has, the gap sits at either 95 cents or 93 cents. This means that if you look at women who have the same education, the same work experience, working at the same company, with the same job title at the same time, in total, they earn 93 cents for every dollar that their male coworkers earn. This gap, this 7-cent difference, is entirely unjustifiable. These are people who are working in the exact same roles, where the only meaningful difference is their gender. And the gap still persists. Note that the fact that these other traits supposedly reduce the pay gap does not actually defeat the arguments that most people make. But to see exactly why, let's turn to perhaps the most outspoken critic of the gender wage gap in recent years. The following is a quote from Jordan Peterson when asked to discuss the wage gap. I've shortened it here, but I tried to keep the core of his argument. Quote, "If you're a social scientist worth your salt, you never do a univariate analysis. You say women in aggregate are paid less than men. Okay, well then we break it down by age, we break it down by occupation, we break it down by interest, we break it down by personality. Agreeable people get paid less than disagreeable people for the same job. Women are more agreeable than men. It accounts for maybe 5% of the variance, so you need another 18 factors, one of which is gender. And there is prejudice. There's no doubt about that, but it accounts for a much smaller portion of the variance in the pay gap." I'm going to talk about the problems with this statement, and in doing so I hope to illustrate how people try to weaponize statistics for their own purposes. But I hope that from our discussion so far, our emphasis of how important the question that you are asking is, and seeing at how slicing up data differently does not change the underlying reality, you can already start to see where I'm going to go with this. The first problem is that sometimes a univariate analysis is warranted. The analysis you do should be informed by the data you've collected, which is informed by the quantities of interest, which is informed by the question you are asking. If you are interested in the aggregate differences in pay between men and women, this is a univariate question. Sex is all that matters there. Still, oftentimes there is more to be gained by considering additional factors. The second problem is more subtle. You see, by introducing mediating variables, you're not actually removing the causal effect of one variable on another. When we say that cigarettes cause cancer, it would be silly for me to say, well, actually, cigarettes have tobacco, which contains several carcinogens, which cause cancer. Or that cigarettes are smoked, which puts particulate matter into your lungs, which causes cancer. That's exactly what we mean when we say cigarettes cause cancer. In the same way, if women are earning less because they are being pushed away from certain fields, being pushed to prioritize non-work commitments in ways that men are not, having fields dominated by them, being undervalued by society, and so on, this does not mean that the pay gap is not due to them being women. These are the mediating mechanisms for that causal relationship. The third problem is related to the second. The idea is that variables should only be included in an analysis when they are of scientific value, and that adding more variables may not always benefit. Peterson talks about the inclusion of several other factors and indicates that some of these factors, like agreeableness, are highly associated with being female. If you have enough factors that serve as proxies for sex, then without using sex, we are able to divide populations along sex lines. Take, for example, these squares and circles. Each of them is a square or a circle, has a dashed or solid border, and is marked with either a plus sign or an X. They are also colored by two different categories. Now, if I wanted you to split these into groups based on which color they were in, but without using the color itself, you could actually do quite well. That's because the border, shape, marking, and color are all heavily related. In this version of the image, the shapes on the left have at least two of, being a square, having a plus sign, or having a solid border. All of the others are put onto the right. Doing this means that we have an almost perfect division between the colors without having to use color at all. If we start including personality traits, physical characteristics that are unrelated to work performance, like height or the length of someone's hair, the amount of makeup that someone tends to wear, and so on, all we are doing is including factors that are gender-coded to serve as a proxy for gender itself. This does nothing to improve the analysis and in no way demonstrates the lack of a pay gap. So, what have we learned from all of this? Well, there's strong evidence of direct pay discrimination, with companies paying women between 5 and 7 cents less per dollar for the exact same work. However, beyond this direct discrimination, it is also quite clear that there are several indirect drivers, which may be driven by discrimination or otherwise sexist behaviors, which in turn have the pay gap as a symptom. Anyone claiming otherwise is, intentionally or not, misunderstanding how we interpret statistical analyses and is lying to you with data. Taken all together, there is not only evidence of direct discrimination, 4 to 7 cents per dollar. However, it's important to remember that direct discrimination is not the only concerning driver of inequity. Career segregation, educational attainment, familial responsibilities, discrimination on the basis of femininity, the socialization of women to not take up space, all of these factors contribute to the large, persistent gap that is observed. While it is certainly true that the pay gap is not the result of nefarious actors sitting in a smoke-filled room twirling their mustaches and finding ways to directly discriminate against women, it is also abundantly clear that the way that we have organized society and the areas where we choose to place value are directly harmful to women. Anyone suggesting otherwise has either not looked at the evidence or is being dishonest with their analyses. Now, as you might expect, gender is not the only factor that matters. There are intersectional effects of belonging to groups which experience unique forms of bias. As a few concrete examples, this chart on the left represents the median incomes for women and men belonging to racial and ethnic groups in 2020. The yellow bars represent women, the blue bars represent men. Asian men and white men out-earn everyone else, then Asian women and white women. Following this, we have men who are Native Hawaiians, Black or African American, or Hispanic and Latinx men, followed by other women of color. This makes it clear that some individuals, like Hispanic women, are impacted both by racial biases and prejudice against women. It also means that, for instance, Hispanic men are not benefactors of the gender pay gap. In terms of sexual orientation, there is evidence that gay men earn less than straight men, while gay women actually out-earn straight women, all else being equal. The explanation for this tends to have to do with familial structure. However, there is persistent findings that bisexual individuals do face direct pay discrimination from their employers. While there's not a lot of good information regarding how trans identities intersect with pay, in a survey of trans individuals, 25% of them reported earning less than $20,000 annually, and 15% of them reported less than $10,000 annually. Across the whole population, roughly 4% of individuals earn less than $10,000 annually, which would suggest that trans individuals are substantially more likely to be living on incredibly low wages than cis individuals. What's more, trans women experience drops in pay following their transitions, while trans men do not see this occur. This provides some indirect evidence of the sex-based discrimination we've been seeing throughout. What does this mean taken all together? I figured I would conclude with a quote from the AAUW's 2018 survey on the gender pay gap, as I think it pulls together what we've been discussing nicely. Quote, "The gender pay gap is persistent and ongoing. It is closed by less than a nickel during the 21st century. Statistics show clearly that women experience a pay gap in every state, at every age, across all racial and ethnic groups, and in nearly every occupation. Women working full-time in the United States are paid 20% less than men, despite greater educational attainment. This gap is a result of gender norms and bias that are woven throughout women's experience in the workforce." Estimates of the unexplained pay gap are often treated as estimates of the effect of direct pay discrimination on women's earnings, but the impact of occupational segregation, motherhood penalties, and racial biases on a woman's career and earnings cannot be dismissed, even if researchers can statistically account for them. Moreover, there are factors that exacerbate the pay gap over a woman's career. Women earn less than men. This is not all because of direct discrimination necessarily, but it is a problem as long as we organize society around our incomes. I do not have a magic solution for overcoming these issues, but I hope that this was informative and gets you critically thinking about the ways that people misrepresent data in order to push a narrative, and that you can be quite critical the next time someone claims that data contradict all of the experts in a field. They may be right, but more likely than not, they have decided to lie with statistics. Thank you everyone for watching, and please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions for me at all.